Welcome. I'm delighted to convene this hearing. Overseeing the investment of taxpayer dollars is extremely important. It is one of the core responsibilities we assume as representatives of the people. I know Ranking Member Spear and others of this committee all find this obligation equally significant. In the years since September 11th, 2001, the Department of Defense has been in the fight against emboldened terrorists. Congress met the increased national security demands by significantly enhancing the department's base budget and the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund to address new threats and meet new requirements. Since 2010, Congress has slashed defense spending by $1.3 trillion, however, and today we are realizing significant negative impacts within the Department of Defense based on those decisions. Readiness of all our armed forces is at an all-time low. Our Air Force is smaller and older than when it was conceived in 1947. Our Navy has fewer ships to meet an ever-increasing operations tempo. Our ground and amphibious forces of the Army and Marine Corps still have yet to recapitalize and reset from past years of combat operations. And, most unfortunate, is that our standing among our partners and allies leaves many questioning U.S. commitment and resolve to navigate through the multitude of emergent security challenges we face as a nation and leader of the free world. China is rising. Russia is resurgent and emboldened by our lack of checking its power. Iran is beginning to flourish militarily from the good deal they got from our nuclear negotiations. North Korea consistently acts out from some form of provocation against its neighbors as it tries to achieve nuclear capability. And extremist ideologies are spreading through the Middle East and other parts of the world at alarming rates. In addition to my service on this committee, I'm also privileged to serve on the House Budget Committee, and I'm the only member of my party to sit on both. Many other members of the Budget Committee and I are concerned about the combination of these emerging threats and the desperately low levels of funding we are devoting to defense against these current and developing national security threats. The picture is clear. These threats cannot go unaddressed, and our national defense is in need of more resources to ensure our national security and the common defense is secure. At the same time, it would be very difficult for anyone in this room to dismiss our country's current $19 trillion in debt, and as representatives of those who are ultimately on the hook for that debt, the taxpayers, we would be neglectful not to investigate and scrutinize how their tax dollars are being spent. We need to be able to look our colleagues and our constituents in the eye to sincerely assure them we are doing everything we can to oversee wise investments. That brings us to the heart of our hearing today. We are here to examine a number of cases coming from the later stages of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan to investigate how taxpayer dollars were spent and determine what, if any, changes need to be made going forward to assure the people their tax dollars are being spent responsibly. Nation building is not a core responsibility of the Department of Defense, yet as major combat operations of Iraq and Afghanistan began to subside in 2010, the department shouldered much of the post-hostility responsibility, primarily because it is large enough and has the ability to provide immediate resources and capabilities. Consequently, the Department of Defense established the Task Force for Business Stability Operations, first in Iraq and then again in Afghanistan in 2010, with similar and parallel goals to support the transition away from war, what is known as Phase 4 and Phase 5 efforts. The task force case studies we plan to discuss today include the Afghan Compressed Natural Gas Infrastructure Project, the Italian Kashmir goat import project, and the housing and security accommodations that task force personnel utilized while deployed in Afghanistan. But not all imprudent spending decisions occur during contingency operations. For example, as the Department of Defense Inspector General previously reported, there have been some problems with the aviation spare parts supply chain of the Defense Logistics Agency. While it is extremely important that we scrutinize the department's purchases to ensure they are smart and reasonable, it is just as important that we use all means necessary to get our taxpayers' money back or exchange parts from vendors that may have supplied parts that did not meet contractual requirements or technical specifications. In other words, if our airmen receive the wrong or defective parts, we must make it right by the taxpayer. Again, I reiterate the importance of hearings such as this one. We live in a world of vast and expanding threats that require a robust and full response. If we're going to use hard-earned tax dollars to fulfill our obligation to provide for the common defense, we owe it to those taxpayers to rigorously scrutinize how those dollars are spent and the qualifications of those making spending decisions. I look forward to exploring and learning more about these certain high-profile case studies, which, as Department of Defense investigators have recently reported, may have benefited from more exacting standards of how those investments were made. And so, before I introduce the witnesses, I turn to the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee ranking member for any opening remarks she wishes to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. I want to especially thank Mr. Sopko and Ms. Weiscarver for the service that you provide to our country and to the taxpayers of this country. Today's hearing includes discussing a herd of cashmere goats. Yes, goats. DoD spent millions of dollars on a project involving shipping male Italian goats to Afghanistan to be mated with female Afghan goats in order to make cashmere. Too bad many of the female goats were already infected with a disease that could have wiped out the entire herd. Too bad that only 2 of those fancy Italian goats are still usable in the project. I think we can safely say that manufacturing warm, fluffy sweaters are not the key to economic recovery in Afghanistan, nor is it in DoD's expertise. But that's not all. DoD also wasted money on an unused cold storage facility, an unsustainable business incubator, and one of the most expensive gas stations in the world. The Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction estimates the gas station alone cost $43 million. Now, we can quibble about how much it really cost, but in the end, it cost over $43 million. And a gas station in Pakistan, similar to the gas station in Afghanistan, cost only $200,000. Today, we are going to discuss 2 dysfunctional DoD programs that are desperately in need of oversight and budgetary common sense. The first is DoD's ill-conceived and badly executed USAID knockoff, the Task Force for Business and Stability Operations, TFBSO for short. Starting in Afghanistan in 2010, TFBSO was supposed to catalyze economic development in support of the military. But according to SIGAR, they have received more complaints about fraud, waste, and abuse over the last 2 years than any other organization operating in Afghanistan. Even compared with the old boondoggles in Afghanistan, the short-sightedness and sheer absurdity of these projects is mind-boggling. These projects are tailor-made ammunition for critics of our nation-building misadventure here. We will also discuss poor practices at the Defense Logistics Agency, which put our servicemen and women at risk. At the core of this hearing is, what do we have to show for our money? For TFBSO, I can say that the answer to this question is not much. Here's what we got for the nearly $1 billion spent at TFBSO activities. A defunct cashmere goat farm, private villas for TFBSO staff, and an outrageously expensive gas station. Is that it? We don't know, since the Pentagon apparently no longer possesses the expertise to address the question. Were there any successes or sustainable accomplishments from TFBSO? Or should we have just left economic development to USAID and the State Department instead of using the military as untrained aid workers? As IG Sopko recently said, tasking DoD to do development is, quote, like giving the Postal Service the mission to run our drones in Afghanistan, unquote. The DoD IG's report is equally damning on DLA aviation and the problems associated with defective parts. For example, the DoD IG found that defective tie-down straps used to attach oxygen hoses to pilots' helmets remained in the inventory even after the Air Force reported that they should be recalled. The flaw was severe. The ties did not hold the oxygen hose to the mask, which could have caused the loss of oxygen to air crew members during flight. The frightening part is these defective ties may still be in DLA inventory. This and other poor oversight and procedures are projected to have cost taxpayers $12.3 million in unrecovered funds over just 6 months. Unfortunately, this is old news. Past DODIG and GAO reports have found that the DLA has regularly overpaid for spare parts and badly manages their bloated inventory. Today, I'd like to know what the DoD has learned from the SIGAR and DODIG reports. Has oversight, coordination, and accountability been improved, or will it be improved as a result? Or does the DoD intend to go on wasting taxpayer monies on Italian goats and defective spare parts? We have to remember that we have many competing uses for funding, and wasted funds hurt our troops and their readiness. This is the kind of stuff that belongs on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, not as a subject of a congressional hearing. On behalf of the Department of Defense, I apologize to the American taxpayers for the wasteful spending that's gone on. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Spear. I am pleased to recognize our witnesses. I want to thank them for making the time to be with us. Today we have Mr. John Sopko, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, Ms. Jacqueline Weiscarver, the Acting Deputy Inspector General for Auditing from the Department of Defense, and Mr. Charlie Lilly, the Deputy Director of Aviation and Head of Aviation Contracting Activity from the Defense Logistics Agency. So thank you all for being with us here today. So we'll begin now with your opening statements. Mr. Sopko.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Hartzler, Ranking Member Spear, and members of the subcommittee, I'm very pleased to be here again to discuss SIGAR's activities in Afghanistan, in particular our review of DoD's Task Force for Business Stability Operations, commonly known as TFBSO, and 3 specific aspects of that operation that the chairwoman asked me to look at or to comment on. The first one dealt with the construction of a compressed natural gas program in Afghanistan. TFBSO spent approximately $43 million to construct such a gas filling station in Sherbagan, Afghanistan. The project was intended to take advantage of Afghanistan's natural gas reserves and reduce the country's reliance on expensive imported gas. However, SIGAR has been unable to find any evidence that TFBSO considered the myriad potential obstacles to the success of the project, including the lack of a natural gas transmission and distribution infrastructure, the cost of converting gas-powered cars to run on compressed natural gas, as well as the lack of a market. As a result, the project failed. The second project you wished us to discuss has to do with TFBSO's spending of $150 million, or approximately 20% of their overall budget, on providing private villas and security for their staff while in Afghanistan. To date, again, SIGAR, as well as the Office of the Secretary of Defense Policy Shop, have been unable to find any evidence that TFBSO conducted a cost-benefit analysis of, quote-unquote, living on the economy, rather than in U.S. government facilities in Afghanistan. In fact, in a memo from June 2011, then TFBSO Director Paul Brinkley directed all TFBSO personnel in Afghanistan to move back to U.S. military bases by August of that year. It remains unclear to this day as to why Mr. Brinkley's directive went unimplemented for another 2 years. The third issue you wished us to address has to deal with goats. And as I think Ranking Member Spears and Congresswoman has mentioned, you may wonder why I'm talking about goats and the Armed Services Committee and not the Agriculture Committee. But TFBSO spent millions of dollars to bolster Afghanistan's cashmere industry. The purpose of the program was to breed lighter-haired Afghan goats, which would yield a higher price on the international market. To do so, TFBSO paid to have 9 Italian goats and 10 Tajik goats imported to Afghanistan. Ultimately, this program also failed because it was overly ambitious, poorly staffed, poorly managed by TFBSO, and in essence, what they tried to do in a couple of years would normally have taken decades. It also, as I said, was a failure. TFBSO in these 3 instances apparently lacked effective oversight, project development, and execution. In addition, our comprehensive review of TFBSO's operations in Afghanistan have identified 3 broader challenges. TFBSO did not have a clear strategy. Secondly, it lacked a focus and consistent management and leadership team. And lastly, it did not coordinate its efforts with other U.S. agencies. Now, one may ask, why does any of this matter now? TFBSO has closed its doors. The money has been spent. And to be quite honest with you, I doubt if we'll recover any of that nearly $1 billion. However, you have to remember there's $12 billion still in the pipeline. This is money that's been authorized and appropriated to be spent in Afghanistan. We have also promised a decade of support at $6 to $8 billion a year in Afghanistan. So despite these commitments, the management available to oversee these massive efforts has decreased. This means that learning from past experiences is more important than ever if we are to protect future taxpayer dollars. Before the U.S. contemplates similar endeavors either in Afghanistan or elsewhere, several questions must be answered, and the most fundamental being, should DoD be tasked with economic development operations during future contingency operations? SIGAR will continue to do its part to help answer these questions about the task force, as well as other questions about our operations in Afghanistan, and I'm happy to answer any questions at your pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Sopko. Ms. Weiscover?
Thank you and good morning, Chairwoman Hartzler, Ranking Member Spear, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss our audit of the Defense Logistics Agency aviation process to obtain restitution for contractors that provided defective spare parts. We audited DLA's Product Quality Deficiency Reporting process. A Product Quality Deficiency Report identifies problems in parts design, workmanship, specifications, material, and other non-conforming conditions. Our first 2 audits focused on the DLA aviation supply chain. An ongoing audit is on the DLA land and maritime supply chain. Today, I will discuss the second report on DLA aviation's processes to obtain restitution from contractors for defective parts. I request the report be submitted for the record. Based on the results of our finding for 65 sample items, we projected for 269 stock numbers contractors supplied defective parts, and DLA did not recover at least $12.3 million in restitution for those defective parts. We found that DLA Aviation missed opportunities to hold poor-performing contractors accountable and for DoD to receive the appropriate restitution. DLA's shortcomings in pursuing and obtaining restitution left defective parts unaccounted for in DoD inventory, negatively impacting warfighter and safety and readiness. To pursue and obtain appropriate contractor restitution, the DLA needs to complete 4 steps, either independently or with assistance from other designated personnel, such as users or Defense Contract Management Agency. Let me go into further detail. DLA did not ensure that contractors responsible for defective parts were contacted and that restitution was pursued. DLA did not adequately research DoD inventory to remove and to identify and remove defective parts. While DLA usually searched its own depots for defective parts, it rarely notified DoD customers to search their inventory for defective parts. DLA did not always return defective parts to responsible contractors to receive replacements or provide instructions to DoD customers or DLA depot holding defective parts, and did not follow up to ensure that the instructions provided were properly implemented. Finally, DLA did not properly track and maintain oversight of defective parts returned to contractors to ensure that appropriate restitution was received. In most cases, a failure to successfully complete any one of these steps prevented or limited DLA's ability to pursue and obtain appropriate restitution for the defective parts. I would like to share two examples, one which Congressman Spear already talked about, where the readiness and safety of our warfighters were jeopardized. First, the 412th Maintenance Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base, California, issued a deficiency report on tie-down straps, stating that the straps broke, causing loss of oxygen to air crew member during flight. These tie-down straps, valued at $1 per 100 straps, were considered critical application items and were used to attach oxygen hoses to pilots' helmets. DLA investigated the deficiency report and determined that the contractor was responsible for the defect. The contractor had delivered 52,314 tie-down straps on the contract. In response, DLA searched its depots and located 16,701 of the defective tie-down straps. The remaining 36,613 of the tie-down straps were unaccounted for in the supply system. The second example, we reviewed a deficiency report investigation for the C-5 aircraft that had defective co-pilot control wheels, valued at about $36,000 each. The 436th Maintenance Squadron at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware initiated this deficiency report and stated that the improperly manufactured parts prevented the control wheel assembly from being properly installed. The deficiency report further stated that continuously changing the component caused a work stoppage, hampering the ability to complete the required maintenance. The deficiency report investigation determined that the contractor had provided 30 defective control wheels. The contractor replaced 3 control wheels and agreed to replace the other 27 upon receipt. Although DLA instructed its depot to ship the control wheels to the contractor, it could not produce any evidence when asked that the control wheels were ever shipped or the restitution was received. For both examples, DLA did not notify other customers who purchased the remaining defective parts and request a search for DoD inventory. We made 5 recommendations in our report to DLA to address the deficiencies identified during this audit. The Director of DLA agreed with the recommendations and stated DLA would complete corrective actions by March 31st, 2016. We did not receive formal written response outlining the status of the corrective actions. However, a DLA official informed us that several actions were either planned or in progress. This concludes my statement, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have regarding this audit.
Thank you, Ms. Wise-Carver. Mr. Lilly?
Good morning, Chairman Hartzler, Ranking Member Spear, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm Charlie Lilly, the Deputy Commander of the Defense Logistics Agency Aviation, headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. DLA Aviation is a field activity of the Defense Logistics Agency, the Department of Defense's Combat Logistics Support Agency. DLA's mission is to provide effective and efficient global solutions to warfighters and our other valued customers. We're a global enterprise which manages nearly 5.1 million lines through 9 supply chains which provide virtually every consumable item to our military forces required, including food, fuel, medical supplies, uniform items, and weapon systems repair parts. DLA Aviation is the lead for more than 1,340 aviation platforms and systems and acts as the U.S. military's integrated material manager for more than 1.2 million national stock numbered items. Last year, we delivered repair parts valued at roughly $4.2 billion, procuring those items from more than 4,500 unique suppliers. On average, we receive about 2,400 deficiency reports annually, and of those, about 20% or 480 reports represent defective material. We take very seriously our responsibilities to identify and prevent defective parts from entering into the supply chain and to ensure we are good stewards of the taxpayer dollars. We appreciate this opportunity to discuss the findings of February 23rd, 2016 DoD IG report and inform you of the actions we have taken and will take to improve our processes to obtain restitution from contractors that provide deficient spare parts. We recognize the issues identified in the report and concur with the recommendations. We agree that the oversight and management control of this program needs to be strengthened and have taken aggressive action. Our first priority was to ensure that defective parts are removed from the supply chain to mitigate any impact on our warfighters and readiness safety. To that end, we immediately reviewed the entire population of product deficiency reports received at DLA Aviation over the last 24 months and have taken the necessary action to segregate and freeze the defective stock until proper disposition can be determined. In addition, we alerted the customers about the potential for defective parts and provided them with disposition instruction. As a result of the findings documented in the draft report published in October, we updated our desktop guides based on best practices across DLA Enterprise. These guides provide step-by-step procedures to ensure that material is dispositioned as required. We conducted training with all personnel involved in the proper processing of deficiency reports, and the new procedures implemented and updated in the updated guides. We developed a plan to pursue restitution of any material or funds the government is entitled to, and will execute that plan over the next 6 months. Finally, we are establishing both first-line and senior-level oversight procedures, corporate metrics, and a surveillance program to enable us to more effectively manage this program in the future. As an enterprise, the Director of Logistics Operations initiated a review of all DLA supply chain deficiency reports discovered since January of 2014 to validate the removal of deficient items from inventories. In addition, DLA has established an enterprise-wide supplier restitution working group consisting of cross-functional team members who will thoroughly evaluate the requirements for enhanced oversight of the PQDR process, examining from a process and systems perspective what changes would be required to improve visibility and facilitate the resolution of these cases. Madam Chairwoman, distinguished committee members, we have gained a valuable insight from the DODIG, and we appreciate any feedback that improves our support to our warfighter and strengthens our management controls. As a retired Navy flag officer, as the father of 2 daughters, both naval officers, one currently deployed in the Middle East, and the father-in-law of a Marine Corps B-22 pilot also deployed to the Middle East, I assure you that no one takes this issue more seriously than I do. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. This is very, very important to not only our national security, but certainly to the lives of our service members. I want to start with Ms. Weiscarver, Mr. Lilly, because we are talking about 2 separate instances of potential waste or inefficiencies in the Department of Defense that we want to look at so that we can address and get better. One was from the past, as Mr. Sopko indicated. The program dealing with Afghanistan reconstruction has ended, but we have a lot of lessons learned there, so we want to talk about that for the future. But I want to start with you because this is something that is currently going right now. As we have pilots in the air and that we have planes flying, we want to make sure that the parts that are in those planes are up to the specifications they need to be, and no warfighter is in danger. So, Ms. Weiscarver, it is apparent that defective parts DLA received from its vendors made it into the services supply chain. Did your team find any instances in which any of the defective parts were installed in any end items as replacement parts for repair or returned to service?
Madam Chairwoman, we did not find as a result of this, but we do know they're in the supply chain because they left 36,000 plus straps in the supply chain, and we know that they're there. We don't know if they've been on a flight put in. Customers were not notified, but I believe that they are in the supply chain and should be pulled.
Yeah. So Mr. Lilly, what are you doing to try to find these 36,000 parts that are potentially still out there on our pilots' helmets?
The way that we go about identifying and finding parts that are in the customer's inventory is to provide what we call a supply alert. Each service has a screening activity which is then responsible for working with their individual service customers to alert them to the deficiencies of the potential deficiencies of the parts. and then work to have them notified and then coordinate the return of those materials to our defense depots. So as a result of the audit, when we were alerted to this incident, we went back and ensured that that notification was sent, and we sent an additional notification to once again reinforce the fact that we have this potential. We'll be dependent now, though, and we'll continue to work with the services to try and identify parts that are in the inventory and pull them back. And in addition to all this, in 2008, this particular they call it a tie strap, but it's a zip tie, a small, about 2-inch piece of plastic zip tie that you put on and hold that hose to the helmet. So those zip ties were identified with several other sizes of zip tie in 2008 as a potential problem. And in 2008, the inventory that's in DLA warehouses was frozen and has been frozen since that time. And in 2008, those particular zip ties were included in a larger suspension where our customers were notified. So back in 2008, and those, by the way, those particular products have remained in litigation since 2008. That litigation was finally cleared in 2014. The result of that litigation was that the customer representative that faced the Department of Defense for that company was disbarred. He's no longer available or allowed to do business with us, and we fined that company, and we received $400,000 back for the deficient material.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. Now, didn't you just complete your audit fairly recently, Ms. Weiscarver?
Yes, ma'am, in February 2016.
Okay, so we're in April of 2016. You just released this in February. So I understand, Mr. Lilly, you've only had a couple of months to start making corrective action. So, and we appreciate your commitment to doing that and the steps you've already taken. What procedures will you follow to track this 36,000 ties that are out there that are defective? So you've sent the alert. How will you know whether they have turned them back in, they've recovered them? Is there a checklist, or how will you have assurance that this has been taken care of?
As a result of the audit, we've taken several steps to improve and strengthen our processes. One of the steps we've established is the creation of a position we call the Product Efficiency Report Coordinator. We have now assigned one person, an individual, who's going to be responsible for monitoring PQDRs from the day that they're established in the system till the day that the material is actually returned back to the system as repaired or refunded to us. And so this person will be responsible in this particular case for now picking up that tracking to ensure that, number one, any material that's identified in the inventory system is returned to us, and that we then send it, well, in this case, because of the low dollar value and the inability of a manufacturer to repair the ties, they'll be destroyed, and we'll get a refund for those.
Now, I understand you've only had 2 months to get started on this,
Mm-hmm.
but how much of the $12.3 million, okay, $12.3 million estimated worth of restitution that is recoverable from defective parts, how much of that do you anticipate that we'll be able to get, and how will we know as members of Congress how much of that has been recovered?
We are conducting a comprehensive review of all the PQDRs that we have in file. Currently, we have gotten through half of them. There are 1,077 total over that time period. We've gotten through half of them and have determined that for those PQDRs, we've recovered $3.5 million as a part of our normal process. So those are things that have been recovered before the audit. That's not to say that there's a lot of material out there. We completely agree that where our process broke down was after the alert, we didn't have a good mechanism to track, as has been pointed out in the hearing, the follow-on return to the supply system and then back to the vendor. So we have 500 now PQDRs that we're working as a result of our comprehensive review. We have a line-by-line, step-by-step procedure to go and take for each one of those 500. We have inventory in the system. What it will require for us is to discuss with the suppliers that provided them a restitution plan, whether that be that will ship those 500 items back to the supplier for repair and then returned to us, whether they'll pay us to fix them internally in our organic depots, or whether they'll just provide us credit back. We intend to complete that process of those 500 PQDRs by August of this summer.
Okay, very good. And I know I have other questions for all of you, Mr. Sopko, but I'm going to let my colleagues ask their questions and move on, and then we'll come back to another round. Ms. Spear, ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Deputy Inspector General Weiscarver, this is not the first report that's been done on DLA to suggest that they are not doing their job, is it?
No, ma'am, we've issued several reports.
How many?
We have 16 reports that we issued over a number of years on the parts and inventory area.
And in your estimation, has DLA been responsive to these reports?
They've tried in the most part, yes.
In your review this time, you looked at just a few parts. Wasn't it just about 65 parts that you arbitrarily picked out of the 5 million?
We actually did a statistical sampling and came up with 65. That's so that we could get our arms around, if you will, what we are going to audit. We try to do them in a timely manner, and so we do statistical sampling so we can project across the whole of the parts.
So 5 million lines of parts, you took 65, and of those 65, you were able to determine that at least one in particular was so defective that it could put at risk those pilots flying planes, because this part had been determined to be defective when? These straps.
I don't recall. I'd have to take that for the record exactly when the Edwards Air Force Base Maintenance Group found it. I'd have to take that back.
But was it, I mean, a year ago, do you think, 3 years ago?
I think,
2012.
In 2012, Mr. Charlie says. So,
okay. So 2012, we're made aware that this is a defective part, that it could place our pilots at risk. And by happenstance, Deputy Inspector General Weiscarver does this statistical sample, which includes these straps, finds out it is still in the supply chain. That, to me, is frightening. How long have you been in your post, Mr. Lilly?
3 years.
3 years.
Yes, ma'am.
So certainly it was already deemed defective when you came into your post, correct?
Correct.
And nothing had happened relative to this item until the Inspector General did a report, and now you are taking steps. I mean, do we need a report from the Inspector General to get the Department of Defense, DLA, to take defective parts out of the supply chain?
No, ma'am, we have procedures in place.
Well, why didn't these get removed?
As I stated, in 2008, all these parts were frozen in inventory.
What does frozen mean?
It means that we code them. It's a code in our distribution system computers that prevents any issuing of that material. So if a customer requisitions it, it's from DLA stock, it's not allowed to be issued. It prevents it. There's no way it could happen. So in what I mentioned earlier was that in 2008, this part, along with several other parts manufactured by that same company, was frozen in stock. There were 16,000 of those straps issued before the first quality deficiency report was received. Those were in the customer inventory. We alerted in 2008 all supply customers of the fact that that these straps and other sizes, in addition, were potential defective parts. And at that time, that material was screened, and the material should have been returned back. If a sailor or a soldier or an airman had some stock in their bin and missed the lot screening, that's possible. Maybe that material stayed in the supply system. But once again, as a result of the audit, we reissued those notifications to ensure that, and ask our service partners to go and search their inventory to ensure that this material would be removed if possible.
Mr. Lilly, I don't have a lot of confidence in DLA's response generally. I think the fact that the Inspector General has done all of these reports and there are still problems should make us all pause. As it relates to the $12.3 million that is due the taxpayers in restitution for these faulty parts, I would like for you to report back to this committee on a regular basis until we know confidently that restitution has been sought and received for all of these defective parts. Inspector General Sopko, you said in previous congressional testimony that data was missing from the hard drive provided by DOD and forensic accountants were reviewing to determine if the data had been manipulated. Has that review been concluded?
Yes, it has. And although we can't tell if it was manipulated, we think we don't have all the data. And it could just be that the records are so poor at TFPSO that they just don't have the data.
When the TFBSO program wasn't doing well for a number of years, and yet it was on autopilot, it seems to me, based on your report. From your perspective, how do we prevent the wasteful spending of almost $1 billion on a program like TFBSO when, a quarter of the way through, half the way through, it's clear that it's not working?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a great answer for it. Reports were filed with Congress. I'm not certain that those reports were accurate and were truthful and really reflected what was going on. And I'm certain, having worked in Congress myself as a staffer, you are inundated with reports. I don't even know if anybody even noted those reports. I think a critical problem you had with TFBSO was it was a new mission for the Department of Defense, and nobody planned for having extra oversight over that new mission. And it was almost like a perfect storm. That program reported to the Secretary of Defense's office. Now, the Secretary of Defense has many things on his plate, but operating a $1 billion program is usually not something he's going to focus or she's going to focus on. Later, they moved it down to the Deputy Secretary of Defense's for reporting. Again, he doesn't really run day-to-day operations, so it was reporting to the wrong spot in DOD. Lastly, they moved it down to report to the policy shop, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Again, maybe very good in policy, but normally the policy shop does not oversee day-to-day operations of an agency. And I think that was one of the critical problems. And nobody really read the reports and the warning signs. I know the House Armed Services Committee raised some concerns about this program early on. And then some of the legislation raised those concerns. But apparently it fell through the cracks.
Well, we sometimes think that we're doing our job when we put report language in, and then they don't report to us, and nothing transpires. This gas station that cost $43 million, the one in Pakistan cost between $200,000 and $300,000. We then actually equipped some Afghan vehicles so that they could take CNG, correct?
That is correct, ma'am.
But what a harebrained idea when to retrofit these vehicles is equivalent to the salary for an Afghani for a year.
That is correct, ma'am. And again, it goes back to common sense.
Which
do a
this program didn't
cost-benefit
have.
analysis. But do a cost-benefit analysis, and it doesn't seem like anyone did a real cost-benefit analysis on this program. You would have seen there were inherent problems. Everyone had written, you have to have an infrastructure in place. There is no infrastructure in Afghanistan. You have to have a market. There is no market. And that is just a repetition we've seen through almost all of the TFBSO programs.
My last question. In your comments, you said this is one of the worst programs that you have investigated in Afghanistan. I believe you said the most waste, the most fraud. When were you first made aware of it?
I think I started to hear complaints almost when I started the job 4 years ago, but it was a relatively small program in comparison. Remember, we've spent $113 billion here, so we had put it on our audit schedule a couple years ago, and we came out with our first audit, I believe, on the minerals section, and we did 2 audits on that. So it's been in our view for at least 2 or 3 years.
Again, thank you both, Inspector General Sopko and Deputy Inspector General Weiscarver, for your great service. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lilly, thank you for straightening out what I was discussing with Mr. Conway over here, and that at a penny apiece, it sure sounded like a zip tie to me.
Yes, sir.
Something that most of us probably have. You could walk down to a Walmart or a CVS, or pretty much certainly any hardware store would have them. So $523.14 worth of zip ties, by my calculation, 52,314 at a penny apiece. I'm sorry that you're getting browbeaten over a zip tie, or 52,000 of them, to be honest with you. I just wonder how much money this has gone on over these zip ties since 2008. Is that right?
Correct, sir.
We have 5 members of Congress, staff. We have 3 of you here, and we're talking about zip ties. I mean, if I put one on something and it breaks, I would simply put 2 of them on the next time if it wouldn't hold. I mean, the people that I know that work in the Air Force, that are pilots, that get our men and women, our aviators, ready to roll, they're smart enough to know if one zip tie won't work, maybe you use 2. If maybe you use a different size one. How much money, is it possible to calculate how much money the government has spent, the taxpayers have spent, over $523 worth of zip ties in trying to find them?
Oh, I can't answer that. We could probably come up with an estimate. It's a lot of money.
Would you agree with me that you could buy a zip tie at any hardware store out there?
Well, sir, you can get those zip ties at any hardware store, but because of the regulations in our FAR and the processes we have to do to ensure that we buy them from qualified sources, we probably wouldn't go to Lowe's. We'd have to follow the FAR, but you're right. It's the same type of zip tie that's out there.
And I just wonder, you know, how much, as a private business owner, I would never spend $10,000 or $100,000 or however much money has been spent from 2008 to 2014, over $523 worth of zip ties. I'm somewhat taken back that we're even discussing zip ties here. Anyway, Mr. Sopko, the full financial audit for TFBSO activities, has it begun? And if so, when can we expect that audit to be complete? And is it going to go so far that it is going to identify parts that are a penny apiece, and maybe how much money was spent trying to find zip ties?
Well, I don't think we're going to be looking at zip ties. The full financial audit is a
Would you agree obviously someone has spent an awful lot of money? More money has been spent searching for the zip ties than the zip ties cost.
It appears that way, sir. I remember I'm not doing the zip tie investigation.
I'm glad
but
to know that.
On TFBSO, we were asked by Senator Ayotte on the Senate side to conduct a financial audit as well as a program audit. The program audit, I believe, has we're putting that together, and if it hasn't started, it's about ready to start. And we're going to just, a program audit is a little different than the financial audit. The financial audit, I don't believe we've started that yet. We've also been joined, or asked by Senator Grassley to conduct both of those. So there's a lot of interest on the other side.
Well, I look forward to seeing that, and I'll yield the remainder of my time. I'm under a minute, so it would.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now we go to Ms. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you all very much for being here today. My question is in the category of lessons learned. Inspector General Sopko, you mentioned in your written testimony that a major source of TFBSO's issues in Afghanistan is that it didn't implement any changes based on the experience in Iraq.
That is correct.
Is there now a formal system for capturing lessons learned, and what are your recommendations for ensuring that they are incorporated into future protocol?
Some agencies of the government have a formal structure to capture lessons learned. The Department of Defense is probably the best one for doing that, and the various agencies of the Department of Defense, so the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, will be doing their lessons learned, and hopefully those will be applied. The biggest problem we see, Congresswoman, is that there's no whole-of-government approach to lessons learned. If one thing we learned in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's not only the DOD is going to be there, State Department's going to be there, aid is going to be there, and our allies. And no one is doing that. And actually, we are doing that at the recommendation of General Allen. I remember him coming over and saying, laying that out to me. He says, the DOD will do a pretty good job. But the next time we do this, when you're going to a provincial reconstruction team, there'll be spots for aid and state and all the other government entities, but nobody has that jurisdiction. We're stovepiped. DOD will do their lessons learned, but nobody's doing the whole of government. So we're actually embarking upon that at the suggestion of General Allen and other people, and we're hoping to do that. The other thing I would seriously consider is neither state or aid have the system of doing lessons learned in their budget as well as the staffing to do it like DOD does, and that's going to be an inherent problem.
I would agree with you. In every facet of life, you need to learn from the past and do better in the future. Well, thank you, I guess. Mr. Lilly, I would ask the same question of you. It's not your fault, by the way. I understand, Inspector General. Is there a formal process by which DLA has incorporated lessons learned into its processes and procedures?
As a result of our audit, we learned a lot. And we have 5 recommendations that we're implementing. As I mentioned earlier, in DLA Aviation, we've taken and reviewed all the PQDRs to make sure that we recover all the money, and we'll report back as we were asked. We've also frozen and made sure that that stock is frozen and said it can't be issued, and alerted our customers. But we've also established some new procedures as a result of that. So what we'll be doing is creating a position called a PQDR coordinator in our supply center that will then track from the beginning till the end every time we receive one to ensure that we, number one, alert our customers as fast as possible, but then ensure that material is received and sent back to the suppliers for restitution. We've also established some first-line supervisor and senior leader oversight to include checklists that have to be signed as we go to ensure that that process is done correctly. In addition to that, we have some corporate metrics now that we track the opening and closure of each one, the total number and the total age of those PQDRs. That report is provided by the coordinator to myself and the commanding general once a week. So we'll be tracking that to ensure that never happens again. On a broader scale, those lessons that we've learned as a result of this audit and this review have been provided to the DLA headquarters. And as I mentioned earlier in testimony, the DLA director has established a working group to take a look at the entire process across DLA, and through that working group, we'll take the lessons we learned and incorporate them into the overall review, and then come up with a total revision of the process that will hopefully be better and will allow us to have tighter control and execute our responsibilities for stewardship in a better manner.
Thank you for that. I hope, Mr. Inspector General, that we can learn from these lessons, and we need to be working together so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. I don't know where to start with putting that in place, but it seems to me that when we're working as the United States of America is working overseas in various countries, all aspects of our country need to be working together to make sure we're doing it efficiently and effectively. So I'm out of time, but if you want to respond.
I agree wholeheartedly with you, and hopefully our lessons learned program will help in that process. But remember, there is a difference between lessons observed and lessons learned. There are a lot of reports on the shelves, but very few people sometimes read them, and they're not put into doctrine and put into the training. And before somebody goes back out to Afghanistan, whether he's a Foreign Service officer, an aid officer, or a captain in the Marines, he should be given a document which tells him what have we learned from Afghanistan before, what have we learned from Iraq, what have we learned from other experiences. And that is what people keep coming back to me. I mean, we do these audits, we do these reports, and I have been approached by many people in the administration and on the Hill saying, so what does it mean? And how do we do it? And I understand that frustration, and that's why we have this Lessons Learned program we put together, brought in some very bright people, and trying to get buy-in from the various agencies. That's what General Allen encouraged us to do, and so we're following on his guidance. Hopefully, it'll help.
Great. I remain ever hopeful. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet.
I yield back what time I do not have anymore.
Oh, ladies, time has expired, and that's one of the reasons we're having the hearing as well today, Mr. Sopko, is so that we can flush out the concerns that we've had and learn as we go forward. Now, Mr. Conaway from Texas.
Well, thank you. Just to make sure, I'm a CPA, and my license is still current, because I'm one election from being back in public practice. Spent a lot of years auditing. Mr. Sopko, when you come to a circumstance like this filling station, gas station, it just absolutely makes no sense in hindsight. Did you have access to the documents that were prepared and put in place in the decision-making processes that were there to come to these conclusions? I mean, when you have a circumstance that makes no sense, we typically don't have all the facts available to figure out how the decision makers, who, unless you want to project malfeasance on them, we're working to try to do the right thing. And did you look at how they got there, what the rationale was for it?
To be honest with you, Congressman, we did not have full access to the records.
So the $1 billion spent, all of it was wasted. Is that your conclusion?
No, not all of it. I mean,
So
we did build a gas station.
50, well, that's a waste.
Yeah.
That's a waste.
But it was built. And there are.
Well, how well is it functioning today?
Well, I'm sorry.
I'm just trying to figure out if it was 100% error. Great, got that. Yeah. But did you find any successes whatsoever in the deal?
We found a few successes.
Okay.
But the problem is, we measure inputs, outputs, and outcomes. The output was you got a gas station. The output was you actually got 400 taxi drivers, I believe about 400, got their cars converted at U.S. taxpayer expense. They're very happy.
I'm not trying to defend this deal. Yeah. I'm just trying to make sure that we understand the circumstances. Ms. Weiss Carver, total dollars spent over your audit, not you personally, but your auditing, how much money spent by DLA over those 16 audits that you made reference to? Total dollars spent. Trillions?
Not a trillion, no, sir. We had about
all right, you did a statistical sample. My dust off my old audit stat stuff. You do a statistical sample in order to project the error rate across the bigger piece.
Yes, sir.
So you found the error with the zip ties. Your overall conclusions on your statistical sample, what was the error rate throughout the entire universe of what you were auditing?
90 to 95%, sir.
So 95% of what DLA spent, they spent wrong.
Right. Of the sample that we collected.
So do you expand your sample?
No, sir.
Why not?
Because we had enough, thought.
Make sure to get the record straight here. They spent $500 million?
Not on these parts, sir.
No. Why would you do a statistical sample if you're not trying to extrapolate that over the bigger? You're not going to look at all 5 million parts. Is that what you said? How many parts were you in your universe, ma'am?
269.
And you audited 65 of them.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And of that, you're saying that of those 269 parts that you audited, 95% of the money spent was spent incorrectly?
We weren't talking about the dollar spent. We looked at actually the product deficiency reports that we're reporting and how
Right,
that all equals dollars and cents. I understand that, but I'd have to get back to the record specifically what it is we're talking about. We just projected because
So
of the
the 269 parts, your conclusion would be that 95% of those parts were deficient.
No, sir, we had a 95% confidence rate on our sampling, is what I'm saying.
No, ma'am, that's not what you said. My question was, what was the overall projected error rate within the overall universe? And you said it was 95%. I understand the 95% confidence, that your 65% is representative of the whole. What I'm asking, of the 65% that was wrong, that you found wrong, how much of that do you say is in the full universe of 269 parts? Of the 65 that you audited, how many of those had problems?
I'm sorry, how many of those had?
Had audit deficiencies that rose to this conclusion that the zip ties were out of whack?
Well, we had many examples in our report and in our
All
audit.
right, don't.
I'll have to take it for the record. I guess I don't understand.
Are you an
what you're
auditor
asking.
yourself?
I'm sorry?
Are you an auditor yourself?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Why would you use a statistical sample of a universe? What's the purpose of statistically sampling rather than looking at the whole universe?
Timeliness of the report so we can get the evidence out to the agency.
Isn't it to look at a small sample? If you don't have any errors in that small sample, you're 95% confident that the rest of the universe is okay. Is that a better explanation of why you statistically sample something? And you statistically sample 65, you pick 65 on a statistically sound basis so that you can say, all right, we're going to look at these 65 so we don't have to look at all 269. We looked at the 65, and the error rates, or the whatever you want to call them, in this 65 leads us to believe that the universe of 269 is either good or bad. And so what I'm trying to figure out is, you found the error with this one part, however insignificant it might be, but it was because it was statistically picked, it has a greater significance to the overall conclusions. Because if you can't get the little things right, you're not going to get the big things right. So you looked at 65, you got at least one, the zip ties that you had a problem with. What else did you find among the 65 that you then projected to the greater inventory?
As I said, we found many of the 69 that had problems.
Okay, I don't have a clue. I don't know, ma'am. I don't have a clue what the word many means. I'm asking, of the 65, we got a discrete universe of items you looked at. For the record, would you please get back to us with a better explanation on what the value of the statistical sample was? Because if you're not going to use it from a statistical sampling basis, why wouldn't you pick the top 10 most expensive parts and look at those, as opposed to picking zip ties? You only pick zip ties because you're trying to get a, all right. On the failure of the zip ties, and I know I'm past my time. Mr. Lilly, did the zip tie fail when it was snugged up against the, when did it fail, and what did that failure result in? Because when we use the words, our warfighters had put at risk, those are pretty inflammatory words, and those are words we ought to pay attention to. Help us put in context. There's an air hose coming off the helmet going to somewhere in the cockpit. You snug it up with a zip tie. What was the point of failure? That first snip or somewhere during the life of that zip tie being on there?
No, sir. Actually, the failure was discovered as they were putting the zip ties on the hose itself. So in the routine maintenance, I read the PQDR that was submitted, and in the routine maintenance of replacing.
All right. So the point of failure is known before the helmet goes on the pilot's head.
Yes.
And before he takes off the ground.
In the case of this particular PQDR, exactly right.
Well, if we can't use, from a statistically valid standpoint, Ms. Weiss-Carver, if you can't project that audit of that zip tie to a greater use than what appears to be the case, then I would have to agree with my colleague that we may have missed the boat. I would rather you look at the top 10 most expensive parts of your 269 rather than you stay up. Yield back. I'm sorry, I'm a little frustrated. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And let me just follow up on the previous line of discussion. I was in the military for 26 years, and I often would call them lessons identified, not lessons learned. And when you say the military is the best at it, we have some significant shortcomings. You know, we're good at having conferences and maybe writing things down, but because of some of the things that were identified even in here, because of high turnover and you know, motivated people trying to bring their own bright ideas and their new assignment in, we are reinventing the wheel all the time in the military. When I read the testimony, when we look into the details of these failures, it is just infuriating to me, honestly. My last assignment was at U.S. Africa Command. We were intended to try and have a whole of government combatant command. We had members of USAID and Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance with us on the staff. We would often see how we in the military, we want to just, you know, go in there and just fix everything, whether it's a disaster or whatever, even though we have no idea what we're doing. Our job is to fight and win America's wars, to kill people and break things, and somehow we find ourselves in these situations where we're doing things totally outside of our core competencies for a variety of different reasons. And it's infuriating to see that after all we've learned over these years, we're still doing stupid things like this, and the waste of taxpayers' money at a time when our military right now, our readiness, our force structure, our personnel, it's infuriating to see that this much money was wasted in the Department of Defense for bright ideas that are just absolutely failed. So what I don't even understand, because I think about my time at Africa Command, it isn't about lessons learned. It's about we're stovepiped on the front end. We don't have the same chain of command. We don't have the same funding lines. And so we can have a little love fest as we're coordinating things, but in reality, we don't report to, you know, we don't have the same title and lines of funding. And so I don't even get like what the authorities were that allowed them to do this. Can you just explain to me how the Pentagon thought this was a good idea and under what authorities they had to do this, as opposed to letting the lead federal agencies and those that are experts in these areas taking the lead?
Congresswoman, I experience and feel your anger and the absurdity of some of these things. Yeah. If it wasn't the fact that we lost nearly 2,300 lives in Afghanistan, most of what we found could probably appear on Comedy Central. I mean, I cannot believe some of the things I have uncovered, and I'm outraged too. Yeah. I mean, I worked on the Hill for 15 years for Sam Nunn, and I thought I saw some really boneheaded moves. But this
is the ultimate bonehead.
This is the ultimate.
Yeah.
I wish I could answer your question on the authority, because the authority is kind of mixed on the TFBSO. It started in Iraq, is really not to do contracting, just to sort of fix things with the industry. Then it's kind of morphed into actually a contracting role. And initially, the Secretary of Defense's General Counsel's office raised concerns that this whole thing was illegal.
Right. What's the funding stream? Is this OCO money?
I believe it was OCO money.
How are we using OCO money to build villas and gas stations?
We're trying to find it. We still haven't found. There's a memo issued by the Office of Secretary of Defense, and this is why I'm so frustrated, and your colleague has hit the frustration point. This program didn't disappear in 1944. This isn't like something that Harry Truman ran. This program went out of existence less than a year ago, and I could not find a soul in the Department of Defense who could explain any of these questions. I call this there's a rare case of amnesia in the Department of Defense. I had to fight to get those records, which Congresswoman Spears asked me about. The amount of records I got for TFBSO, fewer than one of my staff has on her cell phone.
Yeah.
The gigabytes.
Right.
So this is the most bizarre investigation I have done, and I've gotten so much pushback from the Defense Department on this $1 billion program. Now, we have looked at some of the major parts of it, but I follow the lead of your colleague. We're not, you know, there's many more billions of dollars that have been wasted in that stake. So we did not want to focus on TFBSO. I did not want to turn this SIGAR into the TFBSO Inspector General. There's many more problems out there. But every time we open a rock or uncover a rock, something crawls out which just sort of you can't understand. This is a mystery to me, how this program got into action and why it survived.
So if there were no authorities for spending this money, what accountability
Well,
is
it's
happening? Well, I mean, if somebody is illegally spending taxpayers' money, where is the accountability on that?
It was added to, if I'm not mistaken, to the Authorization Act. So it was authorized at one time. Initially, it came from OCO, and I think it was. And I don't want to misspeak. I'd have to ask my colleagues. Yeah. Which one? Which year? Yeah, FY11. I'm told it was authorized in the NDA. Prior to that, and it's interesting is that in FY11, that's when the head of the organization basically says, we ought to shut the thing down. It can't operate. And that was ignored.
Right, and then they're spending more.
Yeah.
I know I'm out of time, but how do we make sure here, and we can follow up for the record, that something like this never happens again? Never, ever, ever happens again. Everybody needs to stay in their lanes. Fight and win America's wars, military. USAID does development and economic stuff. This is, we got to make sure this never happens again. So we'd love to follow up on that, and I'm out of time.
We'll try.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Want to talk about that a little bit of authority. There was the Brian McEwen, the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who was invited to attend today, and due to a family prearranged activity, he wasn't able to be here. I believe he appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee, but he did submit his testimony, which I have read, and in there it talks about how in fiscal year 2014 Congress made an amendment to a law, authorizing for this program to continue. So I think Congress has a role in this as well. So we, need to certainly, as members of Congress in the future, have a very important role in deciding whether we do something like this again or how we apply these lessons learned. But that's one reason we're having this hearing today, to go back and say, hey, did it work? Is it wise, and should we ever do that again? I did want to also ask you, Mr. Sopko, about the amount of money spent, because in Mr. McEwen's testimony that I have read here, he says that there was $800 billion that were obligated, $600 billion that were dispersed. So I would assume the Department of Defense would say that they spent around $600 billion on this, rather than the $1 billion that is being thrown around today in this hearing. So which is it? How much would you say is more accurate for how much was spent on the program?
It's not $1 billion, I know that. I think it's approximately $1 billion.
$800 million was obligated, but only 600 was, I say only, that's still a lot of money.
Our review was, as you said, $822 million was authorized and $759 million was obligated.
How much was dispersed of that, actually spent?
We're actually doing the audit. We don't have
Okay.
that number.
So that's just something for us to be aware of, but that is still a tremendous amount of money. Secondly, we haven't talked about the villas, and I wanted to ask you about that. Your testimony states that the TFBSO spent $150 million to reside and operate out of the villas, and you brought a picture of those here for us today. Did the TFBSO use funding to build the villas, or did another government agency do the construction?
No, the villas were not built by us. These are all rentals. We rented the villas from Afghans.
Okay. What time period does the $150 million cost cover?
Well, for almost as long as they were there. As soon as they came over from Iraq, they pursued living on the economy like that. And until, although the Director Brinkley said to bring them back in August of 2011, they continued in the villas till, I believe, the end of the program, which would have been the end of 2014, if I'm not mistaken.
Seems like I read, perhaps in Mr. McEwen's testimony, 3 years?
That would be about right.
About right. So $50 million a year, and that included security, as well as you talk about a lot of the amenities that were in there, which the 27-inch flat screen TV, queen-size beds, menus for the catering of 2 entrees every night, options on side. So you know, certainly not what I would think our soldiers would be eating and how they've been living over there. And I know it's not quite the same. How do you account for Paul Brinkley, the first director, saying that the task force should move back into our military facilities and not continue living in the rentals, and yet that was ignored?
We're trying to get to the bottom of that. We don't have an answer. We have his memorandum, which he says because of security reasons and also because of management problems, he wants to bring everybody back, and he orders them, I think by August of 2011, everyone will move back onto military bases. But we have no further information as why that was ignored. And that's, again, a problem we have with TFBSO. The records are so abysmal. It's hard to figure out what they did and why they did it.
Okay. As regarding the natural gas facility, the gas station, you just said a minute ago you have to have a market, and there is no market. And I think those are very wise words. Is before you do any of these projects, there needs to be marketing analysis done, and it wasn't done. And you look at the list of the projects that were done there, and average businessman or woman here in Missouri, well, here in the United States or from my state, Missouri, would just probably say, no, this isn't wise that we invest here, we move forward. I wanted to mention, since Mr. McCune isn't here, in his testimony, he does say on page 11, to be sure, the average Afghan does not own a vehicle. So I think the Department of Defense also is, you know, bringing up that point. Now, he does say in there, though, that that you had a question to the Department of Defense about whether the station was still operating. And he says, my staff contacted the operator of the CNG station by email on November 15th of last year. The operator indicated that the station was working normally, that 230 cars had been converted, and that every day approximately 160 cars obtain fuel from the station. Do you think that is accurate? It is still open, it's operating. There are some cars that the taxpayer here in America paid for that are using it.
It would make sense that they would use it. I mean, we gave them a free conversion kit. We converted their car for free, and using the compressed natural gas is cheaper than using gasoline in Afghanistan. The question is it sustainable? I mean, those are happy taxi drivers, just like there are happy goats in Afghanistan. But is any of this sustainable? And the purpose of this program wasn't to make a bunch of taxi drivers in Sheboygan rich at U.S. taxpayers' expense. You got to go back to the documents, and we do have some of the documents as to what the purpose was, and they didn't attain it. So I go back to it. The input, we know how much was spent. The output was they did do a gas station. They did convert cars. But the outcome was to create a market and in all over northern Afghanistan. And that never occurred. And the reason is because no one ever looked. There was no infrastructure.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify, because earlier in this hearing you said the project failed in your opening comments, but yet you would not say, I mean, it is operating. So you're just using that terminology just based on.
Yeah. But what they were, it was supposed to accomplish.
Gotcha.
You know.
Okay, I just wanted, for the record, we should, you know, due diligence, clarify that. And I wanted to get into the testimony of the Department of Defense that was submitted regarding the cost, because I know you and the Department of Defense have been disagreeing on that. The number $43 million cost of the compressed natural gas station, you know, has been used. So did the gas station itself cost $43 million alone, or was that the cost of the entire compressed natural gas station infrastructure project that also include refurbishing the existing pipeline, purchasing new pipeline for installation, for funding? I will say that in Mr. McCune's testimony here that he submitted, he says the cost for the entire project was $5.1 million, and that is for actually the infrastructure. And then he alleges that you extrapolated the consulting cost over the entire country and projected all of those overhead, the $30 million overhead cost for that onto you. And I may be, you know, summarizing, not adequately summarizing what he's saying there, but I would like for you to kind of share what your thoughts were on how you arrived at the $43 million cost. Is that really accurate? And how do you disagree or not with what the Department of Defense alleges it only costs?
Well, I haven't seen Mr. McEwen's testimony, but I remember testifying with him before. The approximately $43 million number is not SIGAR's number. We did not compile that. We found that in the records we uncovered, and it was records prepared by a contractor for TFBSO. We spoke to the contractor. He prepared an economic impact assessment for TFBSO, was paid $2 million by TFBSO to do it. In his report, when we interviewed him, he is the one who gave us the number. He broke the number down by direct costs, indirect costs, subject matter expert costs, overhead costs. Those were his numbers that he got from TFBSO. So first of all, those are the Department of Defense's numbers, not ours. Secondly, when we interviewed him, he said and gave us records about a back and forth between his office and TFBSO over the preparing of the economic impact assessment. Many times that assessment was reviewed and approved by TFBSO way before we came in to do the audit. As a matter of fact, the director of TFBSO approved those numbers. The director actually changed other numbers related to the gas price, but never changed that $43 million number. This is the best number we have. We acknowledge that the records kept by TFBSO are abysmal. We actually interviewed a comptroller employee who Mr. McEwen sent over to try to review the records, and he said he thought the number was wrong, but he couldn't come up with a better number either because the records are in such poor shape. So we're stuck with this number, but ultimately the taxpayer paid, U.S. taxpayer paid $43 million. Whether it included that gas station, whether the overhead numbers are correct or not, it's the best number we can come up with. If we can find a better number, we will report it.
Right.
But so far, no one has given us a better number.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. Ranking Member Spear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm not interested in quibbling over whether it was $10 million or $43 million when we know in Pakistan they built it for $200,000 or $300,000. The real question is, does TFBSO belong in the Department of Defense? Should the Department of Defense be engaged in doing economic development? And I think the examples that Mr. Sopko has provided us make it clear that we should not be in this business within DOD, and it's not part of their expertise. Now, I do want to point out, I think that Brian McEwen tries his darndest to try and defend the program, but in the end, he does say, and I'll quote, "I am skeptical that the Department of Defense is the natural home for this mission of promoting economic development." So regardless of why he goes about trying to defend it, he comes to the conclusion that we shouldn't be doing that. And Mr. Sopko, as our Inspector General on Afghanistan reconstruction, has done an extraordinary job, I think, over these number of years, pointing out where we fail. And to everyone's point that has been made here, just pointing out is not good enough. We've got to clean it up. And my big concern is that we see a problem, we have enough evidence, and we don't shut it down. It continues to operate on autopilot. Now, to Mr. Scott's comments and also to others, I think in fairness to Ms. Weiscarver, it wasn't just the zip ties that they looked at. And in her report, she talks about the defective co-pilot control wheels for the C-5 aircraft valued at $35,000 each. The investigation determined that all 30 parts provided on the contract were defective and that the contractor was at fault. DLA Aviation searched the DLA distribution depot inventory in March 2014 and identified that 23 of the remaining defective control wheels were being stored at the DLA distribution depot in Warner Robins, Georgia. DLA instructed the DLA distribution depot to ship the parts back to the contractor. However, DLA aviation officials did not respond to our inquiries about the 23 control wheels, and DLA transaction data showed that the defective control wheels were never shipped from the DLA distribution depot in Warner Robins. According to DLA Aviation, could not produce any evidence that it received restitution for 23 of the 27 defective parts valued at $825,000. In addition, DLA Aviation did not notify the other customers who purchased the remaining 4 of the 27 defective control wheels. So it wasn't just zip ties. We were looking at more expensive equipment. And there is a problem with defective parts not being returned to the contractor and that restitution is not recovered. Now, Ms. Weiscarver, this is just one area within DLA. Isn't it true that you're now working in another area as well? And could you tell us about that?
Yes, ma'am. We have some ongoing audits on price reasonableness. We have some on inventory. Both of those areas we have worked in the past and we are working in the future on.
Isn't there one you're doing about marine parts that's underway?
We are looking at the land and maritime area in DLA, the same type audit, if you will, just on a different area, land and maritime.
Besides the zip ties and these wheels, are there other examples of parts that were in the chain, the supply chain, that restitution was not sought and that were continuing to reside within the supply chain?
Yes, ma'am. We have about 6 other examples in the report. Switch and bracket part, and the other one was there's several of them. We have pictures, and and that's in the full report that I put for the record.
All right, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sir, you testified on the zip tie issue that they were identified prior to being put in flight, so no crews ever lost oxygen or anything along those lines from those zip ties?
That's correct, sir.
The report that I have before me reads, causing loss of oxygen to aircrew members during flight. It doesn't say could have potentially. It says causing loss of oxygen to aircrew members during flight. I ran up to my office. This is zip tie. This is what we're talking about. It's a single-use item. When you do any type of work on the helmet, you would cut the old zip tie off, I would assume, and replace it with a new one. And if the new one didn't hold, you would grab another one from the bin and put another one on it. Is that pretty much the way?
Yes, sir. That's the way that.
And I think the problem is I think your people should be commended for identifying the problem prior to putting it in flight. So thank you for that. And I know you've got a lot of family in the military, and if I'm not mistaken, spent some time yourself there. And I'm glad to have you in the position you're in. I will tell you the idea that that 36,000 of these are specialized aviation parts is ridiculous. And I hope you don't spend any time or waste any time looking for them. I hope you just get rid of them if they don't work, and you can go buy some more somewhere. You've got to have the flexibility in anything that you do to discard things that are just not worth more than a penny. It doesn't make sense to spend dollars tracking them down. No private business would do that. The other thing I'll tell you is I'll get the facts on the C5 wheel. I know those people well. Robins Air Force Base is in my district, and those are very skilled people that work at that facility, and I have no doubt that if a part needed a minor modification, that they have not only the tools, but they have the talent to make a minor modification to anything that may have come in, and I will seek that out and find that myself. But I would like to know this, ma'am. When the zip ties, you identified that as 36,000 potential problems. are those are the 36,000 zip ties identified as 36,000 individual potential problems?
No, sir, what I said was they were left in the inventory.
Well, I'll yield the remainder of my time, but I think that disposable parts that are worth a penny a piece shouldn't be part of the, what'd you say? I prefer Home Depot being a Georgia company, but I agree with you. I mean, the reason it costs so much to do anything for the government is because we micromanage every aspect of what the people at the DLA do. With that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we've had a very, very good, productive discussion today where our job is oversight and investigate how the taxpayer dollars are used. And we want to, while we're advocating for more money to our national defense because we see all the threats in the world and we see the needs and we see the cuts that have occurred and our readiness and jeopardy and modernization not where it needs to be. At the same time, we need to make sure every dollar that is spent and authorized from this committee to the Department of Defense is spent wisely. And we need to make sure that our men and women in uniform are safe. And so I appreciate your work, Mr. Sopko. I appreciate the lessons learned that we are learning, and I agree with my colleagues as well as the gentleman from Mr. McCune from the Department of Defense, and I was going to bring up that same quote in my closing statement here, that we need to question whether the Department of Defense should do this again, should take on this mission, because there clearly was perhaps some mistakes made over there and some money that was spent that could have been spent more wisely. And so thank you for your work there, and thank you as well with Ms. Weiscarver and Mr. Lilly for what you do. We want to make sure that parts, I'm familiar with farm equipment business, and there's parts and service, and it's important when there's a defective part. If it is something that I appreciate my colleagues' comments about zip ties. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that too. We got to have common sense mixed in here. But if there are major parts that could endanger our warfighter, we need to make sure that they're not only returned, make sure they're not put back onto the airplanes or whatever the equipment is, but also that restitution is made. If there's a warranty, we need to turn it in, get that money back for the taxpayer. Or if it's a defective part that's of major consequence where we could have it replaced, it needs to be followed through. So thank you, Mr. Lilly, for the efforts you are going to make, and I look forward to the reports that Ms. Spear requested, and I agree with, to keep us apprised of how this is going. So thank you all very much for participating. This hearing's adjourned.